Hello and welcome to AXSChat. We're delighted to welcome Ileana Rodriguez today to talk to us about her specialist topic. Ileana is someone that's been introduced to me through the IPC and is very engaged in making environments accessible, particularly around sporting events and stadia and the Paralympics and other athletic events. I think it's a really interesting topic. Ileana, can you tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to be engaged in this topic and the Paralympic movement and architecture and all of these wonderful things that you're working on?
Hi, Neil. Thank you so much for having me join you guys today to talk about this topic that is definitely a great passion of mine. And yes, I started doing this because, well, I'm an architect, and it was in architecture school where I became interested on the topic, but more so because I'm also a Paralympic athlete. I competed for the United States in the 2012 Paralympic Games, and at the same time, I was graduating from architecture school with my master's degree, and I decided to go ahead and do my thesis project in this topic of inclusion and how design interferes in the world of accessibility. I think it has a great responsibility in the world of accessibility. So I decided to take this route. I worked for several years for a big architecture company, and then I decided to go on my own and start supporting architects in their design projects. And now more so with the IPC as I work together with them to make the Paralympic Games as accessible as possible.
Fantastic. Antonio, you're only with us for a short while, so um, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, I'm in Munich. I'm inside the Siemens media room, so where they see everything that happened in their world. So it's quite an interesting insight. So and I'll be about to take my flight back to Lisbon, where I'll stay a few days, uh, and then I'll follow the conversation while I can. So it's great uh, to be able to talk about the Olympics today because it's a topic that the community really enjoys, and especially because we have seen a lot of change in the way how the games have been covered. In the last couple of years, no, the attention is not just on the Olympics; it's going to the Paralympics with a lot of live streaming, also on Facebook. So it's a very interesting topic that the community will enjoy.
Yes, it's definitely a quite. I think it's taking more and more momentum today, and I think for the. I always say that the great thing about the Olympic and the Paralympic Games is that it has the ability to change perceptions, right, of what we can do as humans. And I think accessibility definitely has a great impact on the cities if we do it right. And if you do it right, then you can have an impact in that society. And the games, when they leave, they actually leave an amazing legacy socially and in the infrastructure of the city itself.
No, have you looked at anything that would relate with the Olympics in Tokyo? I'm asking this because Japan is in an interesting situation in terms of aging. It's an aging society, and over the last couple of years, they seem to have developed that they need to improve the way our cities are being built, our healthcare is being delivered. So, do you have any insights from that you could share with us?
That I could share with you. that's a, that's a hairy subject, but I would say that Japan definitely, I think, is a great opportunity for Japan for sure to improve. I think they're working on it. But as many cities who have been quite developed, sometimes it's a bigger challenge, I think, because I always say that it's harder to remove a wall than to than to remove it from the plants, right? So it's harder to remove it on a piece of paper than it is to come with a hammer and fix it, right? So I think when cities are developed, it becomes a huge challenge to make it a lot more accessible. So I think definitely they have the challenge, and at the same time, I think they have the opportunity to make it better, and I hope they will.
So, Deborah, I think you also had a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on what both of you were talking about because I think you're right, Eliana, that the really cool things about having something like the Olympics and the Paralympics come into countries is that the legacy that you leave behind. And I'll use the example of Vancouver. So Vancouver, they made so many changes to get ready for the Olympics and the Paralympics. I forget which year it was. And when I went to Vancouver years later, it still was one of the most accessible cities that I'd ever been to. They have almost all of their taxis can take wheelchair passengers, and it was just really amazing to see the legacy that was left because of the Olympics and the Paralympic movement. So, and going to Japan, Japan's already made a lot of efforts, as Antonio's noting, because of their society is aging quicker than any other society in the world. So they've already made quite a few efforts, but as we all know, of course, in all countries, there's still so much more that needs to be done. And I also thought it was an important point that you made, Eliana, that once it's developed, it's a lot harder to, you have to be a lot more thoughtful about how you're going to make sure things are fully accessible and that you're considering inclusive design, especially when, like in the United States, in other countries, we have these buildings that have been there for a really long time, and we want to keep them a certain way historically, and so there seems to be a lot more things that need to be considered when you're moving into the developed versus the developing country. So I just thought that was an interesting point.
Yes, and I agree with you, Deborah. And the one thing I have seen developed, talking on the point of a city that is older and it's being developed already. The challenge is there, but I think it makes it an interesting challenge at the same time. Even though it's hard, I think it's quite possible. If you look at Washington, D.C., for example, I think it's one of the most beautiful examples I have lived through. When I came I was born in Cuba. I was not born in the United States. And I was very lucky when I was a high school student. I was taken to Washington, D.C., so I would learn about, as a foreigner, I would learn about my new country. So I was taken to learn about how the government of the United States was made, basically. And I found it probably one of the most memorable trips of my life. And it was the first time I traveled all by myself after being in a wheelchair. And I landed on a city that had very little accessibility, but I was with a lot of, friends from high school who were more than happy to carry me down and going through the adventure of taking escalators with a girl in a wheelchair. They thought it was the coolest thing in the world. Probably not the safest, but it definitely was a fun one. And I went back years later. I went back in 2012 was the last time I was in Washington, D.C., again all by myself. This time not with any friends, completely by myself. And I was able to take the metro all by myself without a problem. And I was able to enter in a lot more places that I was able to enter before. So it's a city that has taken some time to transform itself, but it has done quite an amazing job. So I always put this example as when people tell me that it's not possible because it's an old city, right. I always say it's not impossible either, like it's hard, but it's not impossible, I think.
I remember, and I agree, I've watched Washington, shift and change, and so many things are so much more accessible. Of course, we still have a lot of work to do, and I had some guests come over from Spain from the ONCE Foundation, and one of the gentlemen is a quadriplegic, and he uses a power wheelchair, and I really got to see where the opportunities for that city were traveling with him. And I traveled with him and another gentleman all through Washington, D.C., and then we took the train up to New York City. And our trains were very inaccessible. I was very I was discouraged. I thought we had gotten a lot farther with that. And I've seen train stations in other parts of the world that are a lot more accessible. And the trains themselves, and as a matter of fact, one of my guests, there was two gentlemen traveling with me, he actually got hurt on the train because he was going to open up the bin to put his luggage in. And as he opened up the bin and the train sort of shifted, the edge of the bin smacked him in the head and cut his head. And we had to take him to the emergency room in New York. And I didn't really want our Spanish guests to be getting to experience our emergency rooms, but we were afraid he had a concussion. So it just showed me that progress has been made, but there's a lot more work to do. So, and thank goodness we have people like you.
100% agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And the train system is another level, I think, too. And yes, I have many experiences with trains.
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to go that route.
Yeah, it was hard to watch. I was really a bit embarrassed and mortified. I thought we were much further than we really were. Neil, let me turn it over to you.
Oh no, I think it's a really, the transport infrastructure is a really important point because we can, quite often we build new venues for the sporting events, but the venues are in old cities, and one of the things that I observed, and this is not to reflect badly on Brazil, but when I went to Rio was for the Paralympics, was they've made these huge efforts to make the city navigable and accessible, but they were all kind of temporary structures, and they'd all been put up after the Olympics, and it's like that. What we want, and what I think is happening over time is that this is planning to be integrated into, um, it's one set of events, it's one venue, it's one host city, and therefore, you know what? People with disabilities aren't only interested in parasport, they're interested in sport in general. They're consumers, they're customers, they need to be accessing the venues during the Olympics as well as the Paralympics. So there is that whole element of making sure that we design this, both sets of events concurrently and accessibly. But also making sure that there is the legacy, like you mentioned before. So we know that, for example, in Beijing, the legacy was thousands and thousands of drop curbs, which had not been made available before. So the city became more navigable, and you could get up and across roads and onto pavements and stuff. In Brazil, they were, and actually maybe this is why they had the temporary structures. They were putting accessible bridges over the traffic, and having traveled in a Brazilian taxi, I can tell you that you probably want the bridge over the traffic because they all think they're Ayrton Senna. I actually had one taxi driver driving me going, Ayrton Senna, yeah, great. I don't want to die. Not today anyway. So
I've had the opportunity, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, go for it.
No, I had the opportunity to be on both games you're describing, so I
Yeah.
can quite relate. And I was volunteering in both of those games because I'm also a proud Paralympian, which is a group of athletes that basically support the Paralympic movement after retirement. And I went as a Paralympian to both games, and it was quite an adventure for myself. And I remember the temporary infrastructure, and I used to have the same thought. And now that I am closer to the games and can make a little more of an impact, I think, on the accessibility, is one point that I always raise, that design can be made accessible when we cut it at the right time. It's
Oh,
easier.
indeed.
Yeah,
Indeed.
yeah,
So,
And
good
this
point.
is
Yeah.
something that I've been like really pushing for it. And I'm really looking forward to Lima for the Pan American Games because it's one of the first ones, I believe, that will have very little transition between Pan Ams and Para Pan Ams. And mainly because temporary infrastructure is inevitable during the games. You
Of
have
course.
a
You will
city
always have
that
some.
you're overflowing with people, and you're gonna have to have installations that you don't typically need on a city. So you will have to have obviously temporary infrastructure, but they should be made for services. They shouldn't be made to resolve accessibility problems.
Yeah,
And this is
Well
something that
said.
we've been like really striving for in Lima, and I hope at least the last thing with the venue sometimes is the last mile that we call it, right?
yes,
Because it's in many instances is the responsibility of the city. So the influence that we can have, we try to support the city as much as we can. But sometimes we need to, the city also has to engage to change not only the last mile, but change other things in the city. Because we don't do anything if we have an amazing venue that you cannot have access to. So this is something that we need to push more and more as I think is something that the games can definitely change, right? And in cities
absolutely.
like Lima, Peru, I think it's tremendous for them. You have people in Lima, Peru that this is news to him, to them. This is completely news to them that you can actually live in a city that is accessible. So I think it's going to be. I'm quite excited for those games, honestly.
And I think the other thing is when we are looking to the games in general, we're looking for them to have some kind of legacy. So the venues that the host city are building and putting up, that part of the whole selection process is about legacy as well. You know, one of the reasons London scored highly for 2012 was that they'd made a convincing argument that the investment in the legacy benefits for the city were going to be significant. And so planning to make sure that accessible, you don't have that accessible island, that you have that last mile, because this isn't just about an event, it's about building stuff for the future of the city and for the inhabitants beyond that event as well. And that's why you're right, planning for this stuff and making sure that that last mile is also accessible is really key. And if you go to places like the Olympic Park in East London now, it's still accessible. Mind you, I was going to say a greenfield site because it was all built new, but it wasn't greenfield. It was absolutely brownfield. It was real nasty industrial land before they leveled it and created what they did.
Yes, I must tell you though that those were they still not because I competed in those games, but those are still my favorite.
As a Londoner, that makes me proud.
Maybe I'm
I
a
love
little
the opening
biased because I
ceremonies.
went to those.
Yeah.
Eliana, where did you compete? What part of the games did you compete in?
I competed in swimming.
Oh,
I
fun.
so I spent most of my time at
Oh,
I
cool,
think
cool.
swimmers don't get to go to watch anything else, and I was swimming
Right.
5 events, so I was quite busy
Wow.
throughout the entire time there. But it was quite amazing experience for sure.
We love watching the swimming. My husband
Oh, Deborah, you froze.
competitions. We just love watching swimming. Sorry if I froze.
Oh no, that's okay. I've
I
been to
don't
the
blame
Aqua
you,
Center.
Debra.
So I've been to the Aqua Center. It's quite warm in there though, right?
It is very warm.
Yeah. So
For me, it
but
was great because I mean, being in a Zaha Hadid building swimming, it was like
yeah.
the nerd swimmer, the nerd architect slash swimmer was very excited.
Oh no, absolutely. And we, despite being the home of Zaha Hadid, we don't have a lot of Zaha Hadid buildings in the UK. We've not been brave enough, which is a
That's quite.
that was a shame. But yeah, absolutely, it's a absolutely beautiful building, and really, actually, I think a testament to the fact that it dismisses the argument that accessibility needs to be ugly.
Oh no, it doesn't have to be. I think I always say that if it's in the design concept, it can actually enhance the design.
Yeah. No,
Because
I think that's
a lot of
I agree.
architects make it an afterthought, and when you make it an afterthought, you end up with these hospitals, right? So we have grab bars everywhere. We have all this tactile that you don't need half the time, that just becomes a hazard more than a help. I was taking a walk yesterday with my cousin here in Panama, and it was crazy. I found a street where they have the tactile for the visually impaired, but it leads to a huge hole on the street, and I'm like, this is the most unsafe directionality that I have ever seen. It's amazing. So I think definitely if you think about these issues like as part of the design concept, your result is 10 times better.
no,
Agreed.
absolutely. And talking of tactile paving, I was in Germany the other week, and there was lengths and lengths of tactile paving, almost sort of going off to nowhere, and you're thinking, well, hold on a sec, this is meant to represent a stopping point. And it was almost like it was like rails for you to get your stick along and like walk along the street. And like you, it was leading into roadworks and pits in the road and everything else. So it's yeah,
Whoops.
sometimes retrofitting these environments it's not so good. Don't rely on it too much.
Yes.
I remember years, this is years ago. I went to a CSUN conference when it's actually moved two times since this conference. This was the conference where it was close to the LA airport. And I was watching some of the guests, and they were, with their white canes, and they were actually stepping into traffic. And I was watching it from my hotel room up way up, and it was just scaring me so bad because it's like people are going to get hurt. Somebody's going to get hit by a car. It was really, really frightening to watch it. And that's probably one reason why they changed the menu. But I remember watching it and thinking, oh, this is very unsafe. The mother in me came out, and I started like wanting to go down there and direct traffic. So it's there's a lot to be considered. I also remember I went to Kenya once, and I was in Kenya one time, and there was a woman in a wheelchair that needed to get into the bank, and they didn't have sidewalks, and the road was all muddy, and she had to wait till two very strong men came by and kindly picked up her wheelchair and took her inside the bank. And I thought, so then she gets to do her interactions in the bank and have to wait again for kind people to come lift her wheelchair up. Hopefully that goes well. And it just, as Antonio mentioned this, but as our societies age, I know here in the United States, every single day this year, 10,000 Americans turn 65. And more Americans than ever before are using wheelchairs. And so the accessibility has never become more critical in the world than it is right now. And I do like the leadership that the Paralympics show when they go into these, and the Olympics show when they go into these countries, in these different cities in the countries, to really try to make sure that it works for everybody, including the athletes. So it's fascinating to watch. Very important. Inclusive design in the built environment is just such an important topic.
I always say that is inclusion in general, to be able to be employed. By the way, I have read your book.
Oh,
One
thank
of them,
you.
I guess.
Thank you.
But if you go to the work, if you're in the work, if you're trying to find a job, you obviously need the accessibility, right? And you are, as you obviously are well aware, it's quite a huge population that we're leaving behind, who could be productive, who could be independent. And being independent brings together health improvement most of the time, You find a lot of people, people with disabilities who are a lot more healthy if they work.
Right.
And you find people that who are able to go to a park and exercise, again, they're going to be more healthy. So we're taking away a burden on the health system too, if we allow for this to happen. And not only that, the gateway for this is the built environment. If you don't have a built environment that allows for this, none of this is even possible.
Right.
I
Right.
remember one of my very first job, my employer was in a very old building and he had a big step for me to enter. And because it was an old building, it was okay, it was grandfathered. And this
Right.
poor man, it was the most, probably one of the nicest people I have ever worked with. And he was so embarrassed to like almost turn me away because he couldn't hire me. But I was very lucky that the neighbor, who was this guy that knew me for many years, told him like, you know what? I will help her every single morning to come in if you give her the opportunity. And that's how I got my first job as an architect.
Wow.
And it was crazy, but it's the reality that we live in. And you have to be willing to overcome these steps every day. But I think if the built environment would be, if us as architects, I think, if we were more conscious of this, of how important this is at the level of university. In the university, they don't teach us about this.
I
We will
know,
be
which is
architects that
terrible.
are more conscious. We would be a lot more conscious about these issues. I can tell you that all my friends who graduated with me make very accessible buildings today, only because they were with me.
Yay.
It's
Right.
quite
So they
funny.
understood it. They
So
understood
that,
it. They
Totally,
understand
wow.
that it
totally.
works for everybody. Accessibility,
I
it
always
benefits
say
all of
that.
us.
I have this
Yes.
graphic that shows it clearly, like how many people you can take through a ramp, how many people can go to the steps, right?
Right. Right.
And it's a reality that we live in, and we have to stop being so, I think, afraid of accepting that we're different.
Yes, I agree.
I think it's the biggest issue that we have, that we all need to be 6 foot tall and
Right.
and amazing.
Blonde, blue-eyed. Yeah.
Exactly.
I just want to tell one sad story. I know a woman that's very, very talented,
Yeah.
that um, she she has a long history of working with top corporations as chief diversity officer, and she was brought to a interview in California, and when she came in her motor scooter, a very, very qualified, very educated, amazing woman. The recruiter looked at her and said, I'm so sorry, the job has been filled. They'd actually flown her from the East Coast of the United States to the West Coast, and when they realized she was in a wheelchair, they told her the position had been filled. And that's why people sue each other in the United States. But anyway, another company got her, and they were a smarter company because they understood her talent. Neil, I know you wanted to comment.
Mainly I was actually just waving slightly jokingly because you said blonde, blue-eyed, 6 foot tall.
Oh,
So yeah, but apart from
which pretty
yeah,
much, yeah,
all
right.
yeah, I mean it's a
You
bit
do
it's a bit
matter.
dark.
You
These
also matter.
Good job, Neil. You made it.
yeah, woo, yeah, I know. So yeah, I'm living my privilege.
You won. You
Um,
won.
yeah, but but no, I was thinking about the sort of architecture stuff. I think in the UK that certainly there is some element, but it's really around compliance. So people are looking and going, well, I've learnt about building regulations, so I'm going to design to meet regulations and not design for people.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
another stage. That's another stage of the problem. I remember working for an architecture firm and meeting with architects, and I'm telling them like, why can't you? We were building the entrance to an apartment building. We're making the entrance to one of the rooms that could be accessed from the street. It was very easy to make a ramp because it was even in a hill. And the architect was so stubborn that he wanted to make steps. And he's like, it's not the accessible one. Why are you so worried about making a ramp? He's not seeing me. He's never seen me. We're on the we're on a phone call, right? And I'm like,
hmm
well, why are you so worried about making a stair that only a few people can use? He's like, well, but there'll be students. And I'm like, what if the student breaks a leg? And and he's like, what do you mean breaks a leg? I'm like, it's only normal. I mean, students do very stupid things. They can break a leg very easily. And not only that, what if they have a grandmother visiting them? Like, it's so like, what if they have a friend that doesn't walk? What if, I mean, just, and it would be less money to build a ramp than it is to build a step. He wouldn't get it. He wouldn't get it, and it was even offensive to the point that I left the conversation. I was like, I think I have nothing else to talk about in this conversation. And it's how hesitant we are, I think, as designer many times to realize these things. And I think it's also a lack of education, definitely, that comes along with it, that meeting the code is all you have to do. They think if they make it better, they don't meet the code anymore. And I'm like, no, if you make it better, you would overpass what the code needs. But it is very sad because I think it's a loss in opportunity. Definitely, you get, if you're designing a restaurant, you would have less clients.
Yeah,
It's as
absolutely.
simple as that. I mean, I'm in a wheelchair and I'm quite sociable. If I say no to a restaurant because it's accessible, most likely you will lose 5 people
Right.
that could come and eat at your restaurant. And just because, and my friends would probably not even attempt to go there, it would not cross their mind, because if I cannot go there, they're not going to the restaurant because of their food. They're most likely are going because of their friends. So
Right.
it's as simple as that. And it's quite funny. I mean, it happened to me so many times, so many times. The last time it happened, we were 25 people in Lima. And we changed the place, 25 people. This could mean the night of a small restaurant.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's that magnified the halo effect around disability, because once they're not, your friends aren't going to leave you to eat alone and carry on having a burger. Bye.
Exactly.
Uh, so so that burger joint misses out, because they haven't made it accessible. I I do think that the whole sort of compliance mentality doesn't really play into creativity, and yet architecture is a creative art. It's such a creative you know profession, that you would think that solving these challenges beautifully and elegantly would be something that people would jump at. Why do you think there's that resistance?
I think I always say that there is two factors. One is the lack of education, as I was mentioning before, the lack of understanding that meeting code is a requirement, but being a good designer is making it inclusive, right? Um, but then the second point, and it's the only one that I could think of as something that is stopping a lot of the people in the industry, is the fact that we've become bigger and bigger and bigger companies as architects. And in bigger companies, you need bigger revenues. For to have bigger revenues, we need to do things faster. To make things faster, you don't have too much time to think about designing, because the design is a creative process that takes time. And I think the production of the design is what we're so focused on. We need to produce, we need to finish the drawings, we need to be on time, we need to provide to the client.
Hmm.
But where we're not thinking is that if we think ahead of time, if we take accessibility serious enough in the design process, even though this one will take longer, it would take you less time to produce your construction documents. And the reason for this is because you don't have to start fitting in accessibility. You
Yeah.
waste a lot of time in the production phase fitting in ramps, fitting in elevators, fitting in, devices that you need to make a space accessible, because you didn't spend enough time in the design process,
Yeah.
because you thought that at the design process you needed to save your hours to be able to produce an accessible design. And this, I think, is a huge mistake, especially in the leading companies today. This is a huge mistake. because accessibility in these big companies is you sit down with someone inside the firm who knows the code right and left and would grab your drawings and say, this is not meeting code, this is meeting code. It's not going to be about design. It's going to be a conversation about law.
So
So this is
absolutely.
I think that's what the problem is, honestly.
Yeah.
I agree.
So for me, there's some really interesting parallels here that I hadn't really thought about, which is the parallels between the physical environment and accessibility and the IT environment, which is what I work in, and we often see the same kind of things happening, and yes, I know what you mean about the sort of mass production of drawings leading to the mass production of buildings that all look the same. We see the housing estates all over the UK that look identical, because they're not really architecture, they're just plans and it's modular and away you go. But essentially, we do the same in IT when we're making programs, when we're compiling code. We're not, we're not handcrafting code. We're doing this usually using modular stuff or compilers, and we're taking stuff that's been done before. So what we're trying to do in the IT industry is to make sure that those building blocks, and that's what we call them, so similar, to your plans, are accessible from the get-go. So then when you take the components and you know they're already on the shelf, and you take them off the shelf and pull them all together, they're already accessible. So surely what those big architecture firms need to be doing is developing those modular drawings or those sort of plans that are accessible from the start. They're going to achieve those efficiencies. They're going to achieve that that compliance
Yes,
without
I
the
think
effort of retrofitting.
certainly. I think that Debra wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I interviewed a really, really talented designer on my show, Human Potential at Work. His name is August de la Rose or de la Rey. But I'm messing up his name, but he said that when something is designed without accessibility, that shows lack of creativity from the designer. He said, and he is a person that uses a wheelchair, and he said, when he sees this happen, he just thinks that designers are being lazy. And I know that it's not always lazy, like you said, Eliana. Sometimes it's about, well, this isn't a code. This isn't a code. Well, no, you have to follow the code, but at the same time, be innovative. Be innovative so that your design is creative and it works for everybody. Inclusive design should be something that designers, architects take pride in doing. And I saw a really interesting story on 60 Minutes about an architect that was blind. And when he was an architect and then he became blind, I'm sure you know who I'm talking about,
Yeah.
Aliana. And he became blind, and people were like, whoa, you're going to have to find a new profession. And he's like, no, I'm not. I think I'm a better architect because I'm blind. And his designs are just world renowned and so creative. And I think people like him and like you, Eliana, are really challenging the architects to think differently. And once again, go back to designing something that's creative and innovative and yes, meets code, but works for more people. I just think this is a real interesting design challenge that that architects and designers should be looking at and saying, oh, that is so interesting. That's going to make me be more creative. I think that's the opportunity. That's why we need leaders like you and this other gentleman in August also.
Thank you. Yes, I think when I started I actually didn't start as an architect in school, and I thought because the wheelchair was going to be too big of a challenge to be an architect. And after 1 year doing political science, I realized that it was even harder to be a liar. So, so I went back and I decided to pursue my dream of being an architect. And my first interview for this big company I used to work for, I remember that this gentleman who was very kind, honestly, on my interview asked me like, how would I be different from everybody else? And I look at him and I said, you know what? I feel everything. And he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, yeah, when you're sitting down on a wheelchair, my wheels can feel absolutely everything. And not only that, my height is different from everybody else. My perception is completely different from everybody else. I can't tell you if the detail underneath your desk right now was well done or not. And he's looking at me like, what is this lady talking about? And he's like, you know what? You're absolutely right. I think I do want you on my team just because you bring a whole different perception. And I think it's true for any disability. And I think we should think about inclusion in all the environments the same way. You can definitely not only change the work environment around you, but you can also, if you're a designer, if you're working in services, you're going to bring a whole new knowledge to the table because you live it every day. And I think for designers, definitely accessibility is a great opportunity to think differently. And it can be a game changer. If one big company decides to go this route, I always say that it would be a game changer in the industry.
Yeah, excellent. And Deborah, you've remembered August's name as well. And I'm going to trip over pronouncing it now. It's August de los Reyes.
Yes, yes, and I was also going to go online and tell us the name of the brilliant architect that I mentioned too.
Yeah, fantastic. Ileana, it's been a real pleasure talking with you today. We also need to thank our supporters, My Clear Text, waving to Elaine in the background here, and to Microlink and Barclays Access for continuing to support us and sustaining AXSChat over all of these years. It's really a pleasure again. Thank you so much, and we look forward to you joining us on Twitter.
I
Thank
agree.
you
And I
so
just want to
much.
say Chris Downey is the gentleman that we were talking about, a blind architect in San Francisco. So, but Eliana, we do really appreciate you being on today, and we love My Clear Text and Barclays Access and Microlink too. So, sorry to forget these very important leaders' names.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and thank you, Neil, for having me here and share this time with you. It's a great honor for sure.
Oh, no,
We appreciate your work.
it's our pleasure.